A police officer scratches her car, accusing her of theft, unaware that this woman is his worst nightmare. How she responds will stun even the most experienced. But let's start from the beginning. Sherry Larson parked her black Lexus in front of the shopping center entrance, confidently stepping out of the car. She was dressed in an expensive suit, her hair neatly tied in a ponytail, and her steps echoed with the self-assurance of someone who was used to controlling everything around them. She had an important meeting with clients ahead and was already envisioning how the deal would unfold. But her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected noise. A man in a police uniform approached her vehicle. Sherry slowed down, noticing that the officer held keys in his hand. He looked at her car with a displeased expression, as if suspecting something. As Sherry approached, he suddenly began scratching the side of her car, leaving a deep mark. She immediately saw what he had written. Thief. The word branded her a thief. Sherry froze. Anger quickly filled her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What are you doing?" she asked coldly, not stepping away from the car. The officer, ignoring her, continued his actions. He gave her a quick glance, but only shook his head mockingly. "Hey, I'm just doing my job," he said confidently. "Can I have your papers? This place is for people like you." Sherry took a deep breath, trying to control herself. She looked at his police uniform and tried to believe what was happening. A black woman, the owner of an expensive car. Apparently that didn't impress him. To him, she was just another suspect. A thief, caught in his view. "I won't let this go," she said calmly, not hiding her anger, but not shouting either. The officer only smirked. "And what are you going to do about it?" His voice was dripping with contempt. Sherry pulled out her phone, not diverting her attention from him. She started recording, watching his every move. "I won't let you do this," she said. Finally, the officer noticed that her gaze had become firm and resolute. Not understanding that he had met someone who would not give up her car and her dignity just like that, he took a step back. "Do you know who I am?" Sherry continued, still holding the phone. The officer's face briefly showed confusion. He blinked several times, as if trying to assess the situation. Sherry calmly took out her ID, showing him a card with her name and title. She was the wife of the owner of a major corporation, and a well-known figure in business circles. "Now I think you understand," she said, her voice so cold it could freeze water. The officer finally took a step back, but his lips trembled with anger. He tried to justify himself, but the words got stuck in his throat. I just thought," he started, but his voice became quieter with each word. Sherry stood with her head held high, unmoving, continuing to record his confession. Her face remained calm, but the fire burned in her eyes. The officer stood there, gripping his keys, unsure of what to do. His gaze darted around. He clearly hadn't expected his actions to take this turn. Sherry stood before him, confident and calm, holding her phone, continuing to record. "Do you think you can do this?" she asked, not raising her voice, but her words sounded like a verdict. "Do you think you can damage someone's property just because you find me suspicious?" Taylor, irritated by her calmness, tried to dismiss her. "I wasn't going to do anything serious. Just thought," he faltered, realizing that his excuse didn't make sense. Sherry looked at him without lowering the phone. His embarrassment was evident, but he refused to admit his mistake. "Do you really think I don't have rights, like anyone else? You just scratch cars to feel important?" The officer looked at her face, understanding that she was not someone to argue with. But pride and confidence wouldn't allow him to back down. He blinked, trying to find words, but instead he just waved his hands. "Listen, I didn't mean," he said, but Sherry interrupted him, her voice now firm. "I don't need you to make me feel valuable," she said, stepping closer and continuing to film. "But you just did something that will affect more people than you think. I won't let this go." The officer quickly stepped back, but he couldn't leave, realizing that his actions were not only a mistake, but also a clear expression of bias. He noticed Sherry pulling out her phone again and dialing a number. Panic flickered in his eyes. Sherry turned on the recording and quietly said, "I'm going to sue you, and it's not just about the car. You just humiliated me, and I won't let you walk away from this without consequences." As Taylor stood there, he saw Sherry speaking to a lawyer on the phone. He quickly realized that this incident would have major consequences. She wasn't just asking for help. She was confident in her rights and ready to act. When she hung up the phone, she coldly returned to the officer. "You want to justify yourself?" she asked, looking him in the eyes. "You can try, but I won't forgive what you did." Sherry turned and walked back to her car, not taking her eyes off it. In her mind, plans were already forming. She knew this moment was just the beginning of something bigger. Not just revenge, but a real fight against the system. Soon, the video Sherry had filmed spread across the internet. The incident became a topic of discussion on social media. Headlines read, "Police officer accuses woman of theft, damaging her car in parking lot." The case quickly drew attention from not only local media, but also human rights organizations. A few days later, the story gained unexpected traction. The video of the police officer drawing "thief" on Sherry's car had gathered thousands of views. Social media exploded with angry comments. Some users supported the officer, believing his actions were justified, but most people quickly recognized the incident as an example of racist bias. Sherry became the center of attention and received numerous offers of support. Her phone didn't stop ringing. Human rights activists, local politicians, journalists, all wanted her comments. Sherry knew her life would never be the same. She decided to seize the moment and turn this incident into not just a personal victory, but a step toward dismantling systemic racism in law enforcement. In one of her interviews, Sherry calmly but firmly outlined her thoughts. "I don't think I'm the only woman who has faced biased treatment. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's a systemic problem," she said to the camera, her words firm and resolute. "I will fight for justice, and I will do it openly." Soon, the media began an investigation. Local journalists started interviewing Taylor's colleagues. Some tried to justify his actions, claiming he was following orders, while others openly criticized him. Complaints about Taylor's behavior started pouring into his department, and his superiors began receiving increasing requests from human rights organizations. The officer was under pressure from all sides. Taylor tried to justify himself, but his attempts became more futile. He saw his colleagues distancing themselves from him. His actions were now the subject of public discussion. The public no longer saw him as just another cop. They saw him as a symbol of systemic bias. Meanwhile, Sherry didn't slow down. She kept meeting with journalists, speaking at rallies, and sending letters and appeals to authorities. At some point, when her story reached the highest levels, she took another step. She called her lawyer and said she was ready to file a lawsuit. Soon, an official statement about the violation of her rights was submitted to the court. This was enough to initiate a process that would not only change Taylor's life, but also influence the system as a whole. The legal proceedings were underway. Sherry Larson sat in the courtroom, dressed in a sharp suit, her face full of determination. She was ready to fight for every ounce of justice. On the opposite side stood Taylor, his face tense, his eyes full of stress. He didn't know what was coming. The evidence was against him, and every step of his defense grew weaker. When Sherry spoke in court, her voice was firm and clear. She didn't just talk about what had happened to her car. She spoke about a system that allowed police officers to humiliate people because of the color of their skin. She told her story of how she had constantly faced racism, how her position and status hadn't protected her from such attacks. Sherry didn't just expose Taylor. She exposed the system itself. She provided statistics, interviews with experts, and human rights activists. This was her moment. She felt that her struggle was no longer just about her personal grievance. It had become a movement for justice. After several hours of tense arguments, the judge ruled in Sherry's favor. Taylor was fired from his position and ordered to undergo a rehabilitation course to help him understand and correct his bias. Sherry didn't just win the case. She won the battle for respect and equality. Sherry stood before the cameras, her face reflecting victory, but also an understanding that this was not the end. She knew she had to keep fighting, not only for herself but for everyone who had been a victim of such systemic abuse. This was just one battle in a much larger war, and Sherry Larson had found her voice.